Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the lace curtains and into the drawing rooms of Edwardian England, specifically into the lives of the women who ruled those rooms with an iron fist wrapped in a kid glove. We're talking about upper-class Edwardian society women, corseted, immaculate, perpetually serene on the surface, and apparently conducting entire second lives underneath. Affairs, scandals, secret letters, coded calling cards, all managed without ever raising their voice above a polite murmur. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you've done something genuinely wonderful. Topics like this one, suggested by the people actually watching, are what make this channel what it is. Your ideas shape every single video, and I'm grateful every time someone takes the time to send one in. If you want to find us somewhere even more relaxing, the channel is now on Spotify, links in the description. Go listen while you fold laundry or stare at the ceiling questioning your choices. Now, dim the lights. Put on a fan, pull your blanket up to your chin and get horizontal. And let's have a moment of genuine curiosity about these women, because honestly, they deserve it. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to maintain a perfect reputation in a world where every gesture was watched and catalogued? How Edwardian society women managed to conduct affairs while simultaneously chaperoning their daughters at balls? Did they have a system? A support network? A very discreet maid? They paid extremely well? What exactly was happening behind all those perfect afternoon teas and flawlessly managed house parties? Could a woman communicate an entire illicit romance using nothing but the angle of a parasol and a very specific seating arrangement at dinner? Was it exhausting, performing perfection every waking hour? Or did it become, after a while, almost a form of power in itself? And what happened when the whole thing unraveled? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1904. You're wearing 16 layers of clothing, your social calendar is a minefield, and someone across the room has just glanced at you in a way that means absolutely everything and nothing at all. Welcome to Edwardian high society. Try not to smile too broadly, it's terribly common. Before we can understand what these women were hiding, we need to understand what they were hiding it behind. Edwardian high society operated on a principle so absolute it was practically load-bearing. A woman's reputation was her entire existence. Not her intelligence, not her humour, not her genuine warmth, her reputation. And maintaining that reputation required a level of performance that would exhaust a Broadway actress. Everything was watched. The firmness of a handshake, the timing of a laugh, the precise length of time you spoke privately with a man at a dinner party. The rules were not written down because they didn't need to be. Every woman of that class absorbed them from birth, through governesses and mothers and the cutting social education of being observed by other women who had been doing this for decades longer than you. There was a word for it. Actually, there were several. Propriety, decorum, breeding. These words floated through the Edwardian drawing room like smoke from the fireplace, ever present, slightly suffocating, and so normal that nobody thought to question them. You were either proper or you weren't. You either had breeding or you made everyone faintly uncomfortable by not having it. And the terrifying part was that the evaluation was constant. You weren't assessed once, declared respectable, and given a certificate. You were assessed continuously, every single day, by every person in every room you entered. Think about that for a moment. Imagine your entire social standing, your housing, your friendships, your children's futures, your ability to leave the house without being cut by your neighbours, all depending on your behaviour at every single dinner party, garden party, morning call and chance encounter in the street, forever, with no days off. That's the Edwardian respectability system, and you are living inside it, in a corset, in July. The standards were different for men, of course, spectacularly, almost comically different. A man of the upper classes could drink too much, pursue women who were not his wife, carry on affairs that were more or less publicly acknowledged, and still be considered a perfectly acceptable member of society. He had to avoid actual scandal, which meant avoiding things becoming official, but the private behaviour was largely his own affair, so to speak. A woman had no equivalent latitude. A woman's reputation was binary. You had it or you didn't, and losing it required remarkably little. Being seen alone with a man who was not your husband, being too warm in your manner, laughing too freely, expressing an opinion too directly. Any of these things, observed and repeated, could begin the quiet erosion of your social standing. It didn't require anything as dramatic as an actual affair. It required only the appearance of impropriety, someone telling someone else that you seemed a little too familiar with Lord So-and-so at the Pemberton ball last Tuesday. And here is where the system reveals its particular cruelty. The people most likely to begin that erosion were other women. Not because women were uniquely malicious, but because social policing flowed through the networks women occupied. Men didn't come to morning calls. Men didn't sit together in clusters at balls, cataloguing who was dancing with whom and how many times. Women did. And they did it because their own social standing depended, in part, on their accurate identification of who was and wasn't properly respectable. It was a surveillance system everybody participated in because everybody was simultaneously its operator and its subject. The Edwardian society woman was, in short, living inside a performance with no intermission, no backstage, and no option to leave the cast. She played the role of the respectable woman every waking hour, and she played it extraordinarily well. What happened in the hours that were slightly less observed, that's what we're here to discuss. A typical morning for an upper-class Edwardian woman began not with coffee and emails, but with the ritual of being assembled, quite literally. The corset went on first, a structured garment that reshaped the body into the fashionable S-bend silhouette of the era, pushing the chest forward and the hips back in a posture that was both striking and quietly agonizing. Over this went layers: the chemise, the petticoat, the blouse, the skirt, the jacket. By the time a woman descended for breakfast, she had already spent an hour being dressed. And then the real performance began. The calling card system, a social ritual so elaborate it functioned as a full communication network, conveying availability, interest, social standing, and subtle rebuke entirely through the placement of a small rectangle of engraved card on a silver tray. The calling card was, to the uninitiated, simply a small piece of thick cream paper with your name engraved on it. To the initiated, it was a document of extraordinary informational density. The corner you turned down communicated whether you had delivered it in person or by servant. The number of cards you left, one for the lady of the house, one for any adult daughters, told people exactly who you were acknowledging in the household and, by extension, who you were choosing not to acknowledge. If you paid a call, and the lady was at home but had declined to receive you, her servant would simply say she was not at home. You both understood what this meant. You had been socially snubbed with perfect plausible deniability. Nobody had to say anything unpleasant. The cards did it for you. The hours for calling were fixed, 3 in the afternoon until 6. Arriving before 3 was impertinent. Staying past 6 was an imposition. The calls themselves lasted between 15 and 25 minutes, during which you were served tea you did not particularly need, made conversation that was pleasurable and entirely content-free, and gathered an enormous amount of social information through careful observation of who else was there, what was on the mantelpiece, and what wasn't being said, because the real content of an Edwardian morning call was almost never spoken aloud. It was transmitted through the texture of the welcome, the warmth or coolness of the greeting, the number of other callers present, the quality of the biscuits. A tray of particularly good biscuits communicated a kind of social warmth. Slightly stale biscuits from a hostess who could afford better communicated something else entirely, and every woman in that room registered it without comment. Getting dressed for all this was its own ordeal. The S-bend corset, fashionable from approximately 1900 to 1908, required the wearer to stand in a posture that threw the chest forward and pushed the hips back. A shape that looks genuinely dramatic in photographs and felt, according to surviving accounts, like being bent over a fence post for 8 consecutive hours. Women who wore these garments regularly developed a posture so specific that it was identifiable at a distance. It was also, from a purely anatomical standpoint, not recommended. And yet the corset was non-negotiable. Appearing in public without adequate corseting was not merely unfashionable, it signaled a failure of self-discipline, of femininity, of the entire project of being an upper-class woman. Your body, like your conversation and your calling cards, was part of the performance. It was expected to conform to the shape that the performance required, whatever your actual skeleton thought about the arrangement. By midday, dressed and called upon and calling in return, the Edwardian society woman had already done several hours of skilled, demanding social labour, and the day was just beginning. Every spring, the aristocracy and upper middle classes converged on London for the season, a months-long social marathon of balls, garden parties, race meetings, and presentations at court that was, beneath all the silk and champagne, a highly organised marriage market. Young women made their debut, were presented at court, and were then displayed across a dizzying circuit of events for the express purpose of attracting a suitable husband. Suitable meant titled wealthy or ideally both. The debutante herself had remarkably little say in the matter. She was dressed, coached, positioned, and evaluated with the detached efficiency of a livestock auction, except the livestock was also expected to dance a perfect waltz and make effortless conversation about absolutely nothing for several hours at a stretch. Presentation at court was the official opening ceremony of this process. A young woman, dressed in white, trained over several weeks in the precise curtsy required, was presented to the sovereign. In the Edwardian era, this meant Edward VII and his queen, as a formal declaration that she was now available for the marriage market. The curtsy itself was an athletic achievement. You descended into it deeply, your skirts arranged around you, and then rose smoothly without assistance, without wobbling, without allowing your expression to communicate anything other than serene pleasure. Women practiced this for weeks, some hired instructors. The stakes were considered extremely high for what was, technically, a slightly elaborate knee bend. After the presentation came the circuit, Ascot, where the racing was secondary to the social observation, and the hats were architectural achievements in their own right. Henley Regatta, where the river provided a scenic backdrop for the important work of being seen in the right company. Garden parties, dinners, balls, above all balls, the primary venue where a young woman's matrimonial prospects were assessed and developed. A girl who was asked to dance frequently was popular. A girl who sat out several sets was in difficulty. A girl who danced too many times with the same man was causing a different kind of problem entirely. The pressure was considerable and was applied almost entirely from outside. Your mother wanted you placed. Your father, if he had any financial difficulties at all, needed you placed. The broader family was watching. The social circle was watching. And you yourself had been raised in a world where marriage to a suitable man was the only legitimate life outcome. So even your own ambitions, if you were permitted to have them, were likely channeled in the same direction. What did the debutante actually think about all of this? The memoirs and letters that survive suggest a wide range. Some young women were genuinely excited, swept up in the balls and the dresses and the attention. Some found it exhausting and alienating. Some fell in love with the wrong people entirely and spent years quietly recovering from it. Very few seem to have been consulted about their own preferences in any meaningful way. And the season worked in its way. Marriages were made, families were connected, titles met money. A great many American heiresses came through London's season and left engaged to dukes, and money met respectability, and the whole social architecture reproduced itself for another generation. What it produced in terms of personal happiness was rather more variable and rather less discussed. The marriages that resulted from all of this pageantry were, with notable exceptions, not love matches. They were arrangements, mutually beneficial, socially correct, emotionally neutral agreements between families. A husband provided a title, income, and social position. A wife provided heirs, household management, and the kind of gracious, visible domestic respectability that confirmed a man had made a good choice. Love, if it came at all, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a reasonable expectation. And yet these women were expected to perform devotion, to appear, in public and at dinner parties and in the careful letters they wrote, as contented wives. The distance between performance and feeling was, for many of them, considerable. The wedding itself was less a celebration of a relationship than a social and legal transaction conducted with flowers. The bride's family provided the woman, the trousseau, and the dowry. The groom's family provided the name, the income, and the house. Both sides were making a calculation, and both sides knew it, and yet the ceremony was dressed in all the vocabulary of romance. The vows about love and cherishing, the white dress, the flowers, the guests sighing gently into their handkerchiefs. The performance began, in other words, at the altar. What followed was a life structured around obligation rather than feeling. A wife managed the household staff, and in a large aristocratic house, this meant managing a small organization: the housekeeper, the cook, the ladies' maids, the parlour maids, the kitchen maids, the footman, the butler, and the outdoor staff. She planned the menus, she managed the household accounts, she organized the social calendar, she handled the correspondence. She ensured that when her husband wanted to bring guests home for the weekend, there were beds, food, and entertainment for all of them, arranged without apparent effort and certainly without complaint. She was also expected to be perpetually available to her husband as a social ornament, to sit beside him at dinners and reflect well on his choice, to be charming and attractive and composed under all circumstances, to present to the outside world a picture of contented domesticity. Whether she felt contented was, in this context, entirely beside the point. And the loneliness. The letters these women wrote to their close friends are full of it, expressed sideways, in the particular vocabulary of women who have been trained not to complain directly. References to a husband who was frequently away, or who barely spoke at dinner, or who had interests that didn't include her, appear between lines about the weather and the children's health like something dark under shallow water. The woman who wrote to her best friend that Lord So-and-so was much occupied with his club, and that she was perfectly comfortable, and that the house was very pleasant at this time of year, that woman, you understand, was not writing about the house. And yet many of these marriages were not miserable, exactly. They were something more complicated, a domestic partnership that functioned on a practical level, while feeling, in its emotional registers, like sharing a very well-appointed house with a politely indifferent stranger. Some couples developed genuine affection over decades. Some did not. In both cases, the performance of devoted wifehood continued unchanged. If Edwardian society had a natural habitat for the beginning of an affair, it was the country house party. These multi-day gatherings, hosted in the vast ancestral homes of the aristocracy, brought together 40 or 50 guests, who ate together, shot together, rode together, and were housed in adjacent bedrooms for an entire weekend. The hostess managed everything: the seating, the room assignments, the activities, the careful choreography of who was placed near whom at every meal. And it was widely understood, among the adults at least, that the room assignments were not entirely random. The Victorian habit of assigning bedrooms in a specific wing with a specific level of corridor noise was less about architecture and more about social permission. Everyone pretended they didn't know. That was the arrangement. The country house party was a remarkable social institution. It took people out of their normal domestic contexts, away from their townhouses and their usual social circles, and the servants who knew them, and deposited them in a new environment where slightly different rules seemed to apply. The normal rigidity of London society loosened, just a little, in the country. People were more informal at breakfast. The outdoor activities, the shooting, the riding, the long afternoon walks through the grounds, created natural opportunities for private conversation that didn't exist in a London drawing room. And private conversation, in the Edwardian social lexicon, was the seedbed of everything. The hostess was the architect of all of this. and the great Edwardian hostesses were aware of their architectural role. When you invited your 40 guests and assigned them rooms, you were making a series of quiet decisions that everyone would understand and nobody would discuss. Lady A and Lord B had been seen together rather too often at recent London events. You placed them on opposite wings. Lord C and his wife were clearly miserable, and Lady D was recently widowed and needed cheering up. The geography of the house suggested itself. You planned the dinner seatings with the same care, who would be placed next to whom, who would be seated across, and could therefore conduct an entire conversation through eye contact alone, who needed to be kept away from whom for reasons that were nobody's official business. The days followed a predictable pattern that contained, within its structure, a surprising number of opportunities for the thing everybody was officially not doing. Mornings were for breakfast, correspondence, and recovering from the previous evening. Mid-mornings meant shooting for the men, elaborate getting dressed for the women, and the gentle assembly of the day's social groupings. Afternoons meant outdoor activities, drives through the countryside, walks in the grounds, the occasional visit to a neighbouring house. It was during the afternoon walk that conversations happened, that things were said that couldn't be said over dinner, that arrangements were made in the language of casual strolling. Evenings were elaborate. Dressing for dinner was mandatory and extensive. Dinner itself was a formal multi-course event with prescribed conversation and careful seating. And after dinner, the gathering split and reformed in various combinations: cards, music, dancing in the larger houses, before the candles went out and the house went quiet and the corridors, which everyone agreed were very quiet and very dark, went about their unofficial business. Nobody talked about this. Everybody knew. The country house party was, in this sense, one of the most sophisticated social institutions in history, a structure that permitted what it officially forbade, that maintained its respectable surface while quietly enabling the reality underneath, and that relied on the complete, unanimous, entirely unspoken agreement of everyone present to maintain the fiction. It worked for decades, because everyone was invested in it, working. In a world where private conversation with a man outside your marriage was both practically difficult and socially perilous, Edwardian women developed, or rather inherited and refined, an elaborate system of non-verbal communication. The language of fans was perhaps the most sophisticated. A fan held to the right cheek meant yes, to the left meant no, drawn across the forehead meant we are being watched, and snapped shut abruptly meant I am angry with you, you idiot. Stop looking at me like that in front of my husband. Gloves had their own vocabulary. So did parasols, flowers, and the specific order in which calling cards were presented. Modern people occasionally describe themselves as fluent in sarcasm. Edwardian society women were fluent in an entire second language, made entirely of accessories. The fan had been a communication device since at least the 18th century, but it reached peak elaboration in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, when both the need for discreet communication and the available sophistication of the audience were at their height. A woman who knew her fan language could conduct an entire silent conversation with someone across a crowded ballroom while simultaneously appearing to be doing nothing more interesting than cooling herself on a warm evening. The fan held open and slowly moved. I am engaged, as you know perfectly well. The fan drawn across the lips. Be careful. Someone is listening. The fan snapped open rapidly. I am surprised, interested, or both. The fan touched to the heart. You already know what that means, and if you don't, you haven't been paying attention. Gloves operated at shorter range, but with equal expressiveness. Dropping a glove was an invitation, but only in specific circumstances, and only to someone who knew the vocabulary. Pulling at the fingers of a glove communicated impatience, or a desire to leave, or a wish that the current conversation would end so that a different one could begin. Tapping a gloved hand against the palm of the other meant I want to tell you something, and later was the implicit continuation. All of this conducted in public, in plain sight, under the eyes of a room full of people who were either also fluent in the language and therefore reading everything, or utterly oblivious and therefore no concern. The parasol, deployed outdoors, offered its own range, carried over the right shoulder, "I am interested in you." Over the left, "I am indifferent," which in this context may have meant "please try harder," closed and carried hanging down. "I am unavailable or not in the right mood for this conversation," twirled in the right hand, "I'm thinking about it." The parasol was, in addition to its official function of protecting a complexion that was required by fashion to remain porcelain pale, a mood communication device disguised as a sun hat. What's remarkable about all of this is not just its elaborateness, but its sophistication as a social technology. These women were solving a genuine engineering problem. How do you communicate across a distance, through a crowd, under observation, in a context where the content of your communication cannot be acknowledged? The answer was, build a parallel language that uses objects you're already carrying. Assign meanings that the initiated can read and the uninitiated cannot. And teach it through social transmission rather than any text that could be found. It was encryption. It was genuinely elegant. And it worked because everyone participating in it was motivated to make it work. The system served its users. It allowed communication that would otherwise have been impossible, and so the users maintained it, taught it, and kept its existence within the implied understanding of the social world, rather than the explicit acknowledgement. Nobody wrote a guide to fan language. Nobody needed to. You learned it the way you learned everything in this world, by watching women who knew and understanding, without being told, that this was something you were supposed to know too. Every unmarried woman of the upper classes moved through the world accompanied by a chaperone, an older woman whose job was to ensure that no unsupervised contact occurred between the young lady and any eligible man. In theory. In practice, chaperones at dances and parties were often older, sometimes tired, and remarkably good at developing temporary conversational absorption at precisely the right moments. The institution of the chaperone was, in many ways, a form of theatre that satisfied social requirements without necessarily preventing the thing it was supposed to prevent. A clever chaperone understood that her continued employment depended on her charge remaining technically respectable, while also enjoying herself enough to think well of the older woman who made that possible. The chaperone was a necessary piece of the Edwardian social architecture, and she occupied a peculiar position within it. Usually an older relative, an aunt, a widowed mother, occasionally a more distant female connection of suitable age and spotless reputation, she existed as a kind of visible social guarantee. Her presence signified that the young woman in her care was being properly supervised. Her name appearing on the same guest list communicated that the family was taking its social responsibilities seriously. She was proof of virtue rather than a guarantor of it, which is a distinction worth sitting with for a moment. Because the chaperone at an actual ball was typically seated with the other chaperones in a designated area around the edges of the room where she could watch the dancing and talk to her peers and occasionally glance over to check that her charge was visible and partnered appropriately. This was not a position from which you could monitor every conversation, every expression, or every moment when two people stepped just slightly too far into a doorway to be clearly visible from the chaperone's corner. Everyone in the room understood the geometry, including, frequently, the chaperone. There were different types. Some chaperones were genuinely vigilant, genuinely protective, and would remove a young woman from a conversation without hesitation if something about it seemed potentially compromising. These chaperones were regarded by their charges as useful from a social safety standpoint, and extremely inconvenient in almost every other respect. They were also in the minority. Others operated on a principle of strategic myopia. They were present, they were visible, they maintained the official fiction of supervision, and they developed, over years of practice, an extraordinary ability to become very absorbed in a conversation with another chaperone at precisely the moment when such absorption was most socially useful to the young woman nominally in their care. This was not negligence exactly. It was a sophisticated understanding of what was actually being managed, not the young woman's behavior, which was ultimately her own business, but the young woman's reputation, which required the appearance of supervision rather than its substance. The really skilled chaperones were those who could read a situation accurately and calibrate their inattention accordingly. If the young man your charge was speaking to was genuinely eligible, harmless, and a reasonable matrimonial prospect, you found something very interesting to discuss with the woman next to you for approximately 10 minutes. If something about the situation concerned you, if the young man was known to be already attached, or his intentions were unclear, or your charge looked like she was making an emotional decision that would need to be quietly undone later, you materialized at her elbow with the polite inexorability of someone who had, for no particular reason, simply decided to come and stand here now. The institution continued well into the Edwardian era, though it was weakening by the 1910s as young women began to push against its restrictions, and the social consensus that maintained it started to fracture. When it finally dissolved, it left behind a world in which young women had rather more freedom than their mothers, and rather more responsibility for the consequences of that freedom, which was both an improvement and a complication, as most freedom tends to be. One of the primary vehicles of Edwardian romantic intrigue was the letter. Correspondence in this era was intimate, constant, and largely private. A woman could write to a man she was having an affair with as regularly as she liked, provided she was careful about the address and had a sufficiently discreet method of sending. Ladies' maids were sometimes employed as intermediaries, trusted to carry letters to and from particular addresses and to retrieve responses without, under any circumstances, mentioning it to anyone. The letters themselves became works of careful coded art, affectionate enough to sustain an attachment, circumspect enough to survive being opened by the wrong person. Reading them today, the passionate subtext practically shimmers beneath the polite Victorian surface. The postal service in Edwardian Britain was extraordinary by modern standards. London, in this period, had multiple daily deliveries. In some parts of the city, a letter posted in the morning could be received the same afternoon. For a woman conducting a secret correspondence, this meant that a note written after breakfast could prompt a response by tea time, creating an exchange of private communication conducted entirely within the official framework of the perfectly ordinary social letter. She was simply writing to a friend. The friend was simply writing back. Everyone who carried these letters from postbox to door and back again was a participant in a system that asked no questions and received no answers. The craft involved in writing these letters was considerable. You couldn't write directly. Direct was dangerous. A letter explicitly expressing love or desire was a document that could destroy you if it were read by the wrong person. This was not theoretical. The fear of letters being intercepted, kept, or produced at a damaging moment was entirely realistic. As the later careers of various Edwardian women who were threatened with the publication of their correspondence would demonstrate, so you wrote in a language that meant one thing to the reader who knew the context and something blandly social to anyone else. A letter might discuss the weather, a recent party, a book both parties had read, some minor domestic matter, and within that apparently featureless social landscape, place exactly 2 sentences of feeling that the intended reader would understand immediately and completely. A reference to a walk in the park that wasn't a reference to a walk in the park. A mention of a piece of music that encoded an entire emotional state. The language was private, developed between 2 people over time, and effectively unreadable to anyone outside the correspondence. The lady's maid who served as the physical intermediary of this system occupied an extraordinary position. She handled the physical letters, carried them, received them, kept them safe, returned the responses. She was trusted with information that could end her mistress's marriage, social life, and in some cases financial security. The compensation for this trust was partly financial. A discreet lady's maid was a valuable professional asset and was paid accordingly, and partly relational, in the sense that the intimacy of the position created a bond between mistress and maid that was genuinely unusual in a world with such rigid social stratification. What happened to these letters afterward was a matter of considerable anxiety. Some women destroyed them, burning correspondence at the end of an attachment with the thoroughness of someone clearing evidence, which is, functionally, what they were doing. Others kept them, locked in private drawers or travelling cases, for reasons that ranged from genuine sentiment to strategic calculation. The letters that survived into archives and libraries tell us an enormous amount about the interior lives of women who left very little other direct testimony about what they actually felt. They are, in a sense, the truest documents these women ever produced, the only writing where the performance was not required. If you want a case study in what happened when Edwardian romantic discretion completely unravelled, look no further than Frances Evelyn Greville, Countess of Warwick, known to everyone as Daisy. Daisy was a great beauty, a society hostess, and for several years the mistress of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. This was, remarkably, considered acceptable at the upper levels of society, provided everyone maintained the necessary fictions. What was not acceptable was what Daisy did after the relationship ended. She kept the letters, ardent, compromising, unmistakably royal letters. And years later, short of money and increasingly aligned with socialist causes that had thoroughly alienated her old social circle, Daisy briefly considered selling them. The resulting panic in aristocratic and royal circles was quiet, total, and deeply instructive about exactly how much of Edwardian respectability depended on everyone simply agreeing not to look directly at certain things. Daisy Warwick was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable women of her era. Born Frances Evelyn Maynard in 1861, she inherited a vast fortune and became Countess of Warwick upon her marriage, a union that gave her social position, a magnificent house, and a husband she appears to have been largely indifferent to. What she had in full was beauty, intelligence, charm, and an appetite for life that the conventional social round could not entirely satisfy. She was witty, politically interested, and possessed of the kind of social magnetism that drew people toward her without apparent effort. Her relationship with the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, began in the 1880s and lasted for several years. This was not a secret in the sense of being unknown. Within the aristocratic circles they both inhabited, it was understood. The Prince of Wales had a series of acknowledged favourites over the years, and the women involved occupied a peculiar social position, not exactly respectable by the official rules, and yet too closely connected to royalty to be treated as though the official rules applied. Daisy gave dinners. She hosted weekends. She moved through London society with the confidence of someone whose position, however technically irregular, was in practice unassailable. When the prince moved on, these relationships did not tend toward permanence. Daisy was left with her memories, her friendships, and her letters. The letters were the problem. Edward had written to her warmly, frequently, and in the unguarded language of a man who had not imagined the letters surviving into a different political moment. By the 1900s, Daisy had undergone a dramatic political conversion. She had become, to the considerable bewilderment of her social circle, a committed socialist, championing the rights of agricultural workers and spending her substantial fortune on causes her former friends found both admirable and baffling. She had also spent quite a lot of that fortune. She needed money. The resulting crisis, in 1914, was extraordinary. Daisy attempted to sell the letters to an American publisher. The lawyers, the courtiers, the family connections, and the considerable machinery of British establishment panic mobilized with an efficiency that was almost impressive. The letters were not published. Daisy received a settlement of some kind. The precise terms remain obscure, and the crisis subsided. The royal letters went back into discretion, and the incident was filed in the large and well-managed archive of things that had happened but were not to be discussed. What Daisy's story illustrates is the fundamental instability at the heart of the whole Edwardian arrangement. The system worked because everyone agreed to maintain it. When one person stopped agreeing, when someone kept the letters, or told the journalist, or filed for divorce, or decided that the settled fictions were no longer worth their price, the whole elegant structure was suddenly very fragile indeed. Daisy didn't bring it down, but she showed everyone exactly how easily it could be. Not every Edwardian woman played the game of hidden affairs and coded fans. Some, like Langtry, the Jersey Lily, simply declined to hide at all and became famous for it. Langtry was a beauty of such extraordinary social presence that she moved from respectable married woman to acknowledged mistress of the Prince of Wales to celebrated actress and international celebrity, with a smoothness that should have been mathematically impossible in this era. Her secret, to the extent she had one, was a combination of genuine charm, strategic social intelligence, and a level of confidence so absolute that it created its own kind of force field. Society disapproved of her in theory. In practice, it was obsessed with her, which is functionally the same thing. Emily Charlotte Le Breton was born in 1853 on the island of Jersey, the daughter of a dean who was, according to various accounts, considerably more interested in the local women than his ecclesiastical position strictly required. She married Edward Langtry in 1874, a union that was not particularly romantic on either side, but provided her with the social position of a married woman and the freedom to move in London circles without the encumbrances of being either too poor or too obscure to matter. What happened next was essentially the social equivalent of a comet appearing. Lily arrived in London society in the 1870s, and people simply couldn't stop looking at her. Artists painted her, Millet, With, Pointer, photographers photographed her, society hostesses invited her. The Prince of Wales noticed her, which in the social ecosystem of late Victorian England was roughly equivalent to being endorsed by the most influential possible authority. Their relationship became known and, within the charmed circle of aristocratic society, accepted. What makes Langtry's story remarkable in the context of all the elaborate concealment we've been discussing is how little she concealed. She did not pretend. She did not deploy fan language or strategic house party room assignments or carefully coded letters delivered by ladies' maids. She moved through the world as what she was, a beautiful, charming woman of considerable social intelligence who had attracted the most powerful social patron available, and she did it with a cheerfulness that was either genuine or a performance so perfect that the distinction ceased to matter. When her marriage eventually deteriorated, Edward Langtry was not a capable manager of money or emotion, and the marriage had been unhappy for years. Lily made another apparently impossible move. She went on the stage. For a woman of her social position, becoming a professional actress was social annihilation. Actresses were not received in polite society. They were associated with a degree of moral looseness that was, in the Edwardian social vocabulary, incompatible with respectability. Lily went anyway, and society, astonishingly, followed her. She performed to packed houses. She toured America and was received as a celebrity of the first order. She became more famous as an actress than she had ever been as a society beauty. Her success demonstrated something uncomfortable about the entire respectable edifice. It depended on social consensus, and social consensus was not entirely rational. Lily Langtry succeeded because enough powerful and fashionable people decided to find her fascinating rather than scandalous. And once that decision was made, the machinery of social disapproval couldn't quite get traction. She was proof that the system had vulnerabilities and that a sufficiently confident, sufficiently charming woman might, under precisely the right circumstances, simply walk straight through the wall. In the Edwardian era, divorce existed. It was legal. It was, theoretically, available. And it was considered roughly equivalent to social annihilation for the woman involved, regardless of who had actually done what to whom. A divorced woman was not received in polite society. She was not presented at court. She could not attend royal functions. She could not appear on certain guest lists. She lost her social position as completely and permanently as if she had been erased with a very polite rubber. This is why the vast majority of Edwardian society women, however miserable their marriages, however egregious their husband's behaviour, did not divorce. They found other solutions. Solutions involving fan angles and house party room assignments, and very discreet ladies' maids who were paid extremely well. The legal framework for divorce in Edwardian England was itself a masterpiece of inequality, so brazen it was almost admirable in its consistency. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had made divorce legally possible for the first time without a private act of Parliament, which was progress of a kind. But the grounds were different depending on your sex, in a way that told you everything you needed to know about whose interests the law was designed to protect. A husband could divorce his wife on the grounds of adultery alone. A wife seeking to divorce her husband had to prove not just adultery, but adultery combined with something else: cruelty, desertion, incest, bigamy. Adultery by itself, committed by a husband, was considered insufficient grounds. The law, in other words, had decided that a man straying was a personal failing, while a woman straying was a categorical catastrophe, and the legal procedures reflected this assessment with perfect fidelity. This meant that a woman trapped in a marriage with a husband who was unfaithful, cold, absent, or unkind had remarkably few official options. She could petition for a judicial separation, which released her from the obligation to live with him but did not allow her to remarry. She could endure, or she could divorce, with all the social consequences that followed. The social consequences were not small. A divorced woman was, in the language of the time, ruined, a word that covered everything from barred from court presentations to finding that certain hostesses no longer sent invitations, to discovering that friends who had seemed loyal quietly stopped calling. The double standard extended into every corner of this. A man who divorced his wife for adultery retained his social position entirely. He might, after a decent interval, remarry quite respectably. His clubs remained open to him. His friendships continued. The divorce had happened to his wife, in the social accounting, regardless of the facts. She was the one marked by it, the one who carried the social damage forward into every subsequent room she entered. And yet, within this impossible structure, some women divorced. Usually women who had already lost so much: financially ruined husbands, genuine physical danger, circumstances so catastrophic that the social cost of divorce was less terrible than the alternative. Their stories are in the records, in the court documents, in the newspapers that reported divorce proceedings with a thoroughness that guaranteed maximum social damage to all parties. Reading them, you encounter women who had clearly reached the absolute limit of what could be endured, who had done every calculation and found that even annihilation was preferable to continuing. The women who did not divorce, the vast majority, simply absorbed their marriages into the fabric of their performances and got on with it. They managed. They found compensations. They conducted their inner lives in the spaces the performance didn't reach. And they became extraordinarily skilled at the thing Edwardian society most required of them, making the best of an arrangement they had never been asked to choose. A lady's maid in an Edwardian upper-class household occupied one of the most peculiar positions in the social hierarchy. She was intimate with her mistress in a way that no equal could be, dressing her, doing her hair, attending her in private moments, and yet she was utterly subordinate. She knew everything. She knew which letters arrived by which means, which dresses were worn on which occasions, what time her mistress returned home, and in what emotional state. A good lady's maid was loyal, silent, and possessed of a discretion so absolute it was practically architectural. She could also, if she chose to be disloyal, destroy her mistress completely. The relationship was one of mutual dependence, so total it was almost a form of intimacy, and it shaped the entire emotional landscape of an Edwardian woman's private life. The lady's maid was the first person her mistress saw in the morning, and frequently the last at night. She helped her dress and undress, a process that, given the complexity of Edwardian clothing, was a genuine physical collaboration requiring skill and familiarity. She arranged her hair, which in an era of elaborate coiffures required considerable technical knowledge and a steady hand. She packed her trunks when she travelled, managed her wardrobe between seasons, mended what needed mending and pressed what needed pressing. She was present, in other words, for the version of her mistress that nobody else ever saw, undressed, uncoiffed, unperforming, before the daily assembly of the public self had begun. This intimacy created a bond that was genuinely unusual in a world governed by strict social hierarchy. A duchess and her cook were employer and employee, separated by the vast distance of class, communicating through the household hierarchy of butler and housekeeper. A duchess and her lady's maid were something more complicated. Employer and employee, yes, but also two women who spent hours together every day in close physical proximity, who had seen each other's most unguarded moments, and who were connected by a web of shared knowledge that was, in its way, as binding as anything else in either of their lives. The knowledge the lady's maid accumulated was, in the context of an Edwardian society woman's life, enormous. She handled the letters, received them, sometimes carried them, occasionally sealed them. She knew which dresses corresponded to which occasions, and could therefore map her mistress's social movements with considerable accuracy. She noticed moods, anxieties, the particular quality of a homecoming. She knew, in the way that people who help you dress every morning inevitably know whether things were going well or badly in the areas of life that her mistress discussed with nobody. The compensation for all of this was partly wages. A skilled and trusted lady's maid commanded a good salary and knew her value, and partly the social status that came from serving a prominent household. Being the lady's maid to a countess or a duchess was itself a position of some standing among the servant class. You reflected your mistress's social position downward, in the same way that she reflected her husband's upward. But the real compensation, in many cases, was something more intangible, the sense of being genuinely necessary to someone, of being trusted with the things that mattered most, of occupying a position of real importance in the private machinery of a life. The lady's maid who carried the secret letters and held the private confidences and never, in 30 years of service, said a word to anyone, she knew what she was worth, and so did her mistress, which is why when that mistress wrote her will, the lady's maid was almost always in it. It is impossible to discuss affairs in Edwardian high society without acknowledging that the social tone was set, quite literally, at the top. Edward VII, both as Prince of Wales and later as King, maintained a succession of acknowledged mistresses with a cheerfulness that his mother, Queen Victoria, found appalling and his social circle found entirely normal. The Marlborough house set, the fashionable circle centred around Edward during the long decades before he became king, operated on an essentially continental European model of aristocratic marriage. The husband had his affairs, the wife had hers, everyone was charming about it in public, and domestic stability was maintained through the application of excellent manners and strategic social architecture. The code was, anything could happen, but nothing could be acknowledged. Edward's relationship with his own marriage was a study in Edwardian compartmentalization. His wife, Alexandra of Denmark, was by all accounts genuinely beloved by him and deeply respected, and he was also, throughout their marriage, consistently and enthusiastically unfaithful. This is not a contradiction that the Edwardian social world found particularly troubling, because it had arranged itself specifically to accommodate it. Alexandra appears in the surviving accounts to have been both aware of and resigned to her husband's nature, possessing a dignity so absolute and a composure so complete that she became, paradoxically, one of the most admired women of her era, in part because of how she managed a situation that would have broken someone less steely. The Marlborough house set, named for the London residence where Edward held his court during the long Victorian decades before his mother's death gave him a throne, was the fashionable aristocratic circle that arranged itself around the prince and absorbed his social tone. It was louder, more continental, more relaxed about morality than the official court of Queen Victoria, which was precisely its appeal. Wealthy, titled, energetic people gathered around Edward not merely because of his position, but because his circle was where the interesting things happened, the good dinners, the sharp conversation, the house parties that were actually enjoyable, the social permission to be slightly more honestly human than the Victorian official culture allowed. The women of the Marlborough house set understood the arrangement. Their husbands were in the same social circle as the man who might be pursuing them. Their own social positions were inseparable from those of their husbands, and yet the atmosphere of the set was one in which a woman could be genuinely witty, genuinely interesting, genuinely present as a person rather than an ornament, provided she also remained, officially, entirely respectable. The tension between these requirements produced a social atmosphere of remarkable sophistication and considerable strain. What the Marlborough House set created, in practical terms, was a permission structure. If the Prince of Wales maintained mistresses cheerfully and openly within the social fiction of respectability, and if his circle continued to function normally, and if nobody was ruined and nothing officially collapsed, then the rules were demonstrated to be more flexible than they appeared. The flexibility wasn't available to everyone. A woman without the right connections, the right husband, the right level of social capital could still be destroyed by behaviour that a woman in the set conducted without consequence. But the existence of the set established, at the very apex of society, a model in which the official rules and the actual behaviour were understood to be different things, which gave everyone below that apex a set of mental permissions that they used, with varying degrees of caution, for the next several decades. The great Edwardian house party hostess was, in the language of our time, a project manager of extraordinary skill. She coordinated the arrivals of 40 or 50 guests across a long weekend, managed the feeding, entertainment, and accommodation of all of them, monitored the emotional temperature of every relationship in the room, and ensured that the weekend produced the social outcomes, new alliances, useful connections, suitable introductions that justified the entire colossal expense. She also, if she was truly skilled, managed the sleeping arrangements with a level of social intelligence that required her to know, without asking directly, which guests would benefit from adjacency and which absolutely could not be placed near each other under any circumstances. This was not a small job. This was geopolitics in a country house. The planning began weeks before the guests arrived. Invitations went out, acceptances were tracked, and the guest list was assembled with the care of someone constructing a seating plan for a summit meeting, because in social terms, that is approximately what it was. Who you invited communicated your own political and social alignments, your friends, your patrons, your allies, the people whose good opinion you needed or whose connection to someone useful you wanted to cultivate. Who you didn't invite communicated the same things in a different register. An uninvited person noticed their absence from the list and understood its meaning perfectly. The house itself had to be prepared, bedrooms aired and staffed, menus planned across all the meals of a 4-day weekend, entertainment organised for every part of every day in a way that appeared effortless. The appearance of effortlessness was itself one of the hostess's primary obligations. Guests were not supposed to see the machinery. They were supposed to arrive and find everything simply, naturally, mysteriously wonderful, the fires lit, the flowers arranged, the meals appearing at the correct moment, the activities available without anyone seeming to have arranged them. That this required weeks of planning and the coordinated effort of a household staff of 20 or more was entirely beside the point and was never discussed. The menus alone were a social statement. Food at a great Edwardian house party was elaborate, abundant, and expressive of the household's wealth and the hostess's taste. A typical dinner ran to 8 or 10 courses: soup, fish, an entree, a remove, game, a sweet, a savoury, dessert. Each course required specific wines. The table was set with silver and crystal and flowers. The cook was managing a small catering operation for 40 people, producing food of restaurant quality on a daily basis. A hostess who presided over excellent food was considered to be doing her social duty particularly well. A hostess whose cook was unreliable was considered, however unfairly, to be falling slightly short. And underneath all of the logistics was the real work, the social management of 40 people with varying relationships to each other, varying temperaments, varying agendas, and the inevitable complications that arose when you took the same people out of their normal contexts and housed them together for several days. Jealousies surfaced. Old tensions reappeared. Someone drank slightly too much at dinner and said something that required careful management the following morning. Two people who should not have been placed near each other ended up having a conversation that needed to be quietly redirected. The hostess saw all of it, managed all of it, and was present throughout, warm, unruffled, apparently delighted by everything, without allowing any of the management to be visible. It was, as a professional achievement, extraordinary, and it was so thoroughly coded as a domestic and social function, so completely embedded in the category of things women simply did, that it received essentially no recognition as the skilled and demanding work it was. The house party succeeded because the hostess was brilliant. But the hostess was not called brilliant. She was called a wonderful hostess, which was understood to be a natural quality rather than an earned one. Of course she was wonderful. She was a woman. What else would she be? In a world that offered women almost no legitimate route to expressing distress, unhappiness, or the desire to simply opt out for a while, illness became a language. Nervous collapse, hysteria, neurasthenia, the Edwardian medical vocabulary for women under social pressure was extensive and conveniently vague. A woman who had reached the limits of what she could tolerate might retire to her room, be diagnosed with nerves by a sympathetic doctor, and spend several weeks being waited on and excused from all social obligation. The social machinery accommodated this entirely. It was understood, if not exactly discussed. A woman who needed to not be somewhere for a while needed only to be sufficiently unwell, and the Edwardian world would gently look away and ask no questions. The medical framework that supported this was, by modern standards, a fascinating tangle of genuine science, cultural assumption, and motivated reasoning. Neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, was a diagnosis fashionable enough in this period that it functioned almost as a social category. It was applied predominantly to women and to educated, sensitive men, and it covered a range of symptoms that included fatigue, anxiety, depression, headaches, digestive complaints, and the general sense that the world was too much. The cure prescribed typically involved rest, withdrawal from social activity, and sometimes a period in a private nursing home or spa, which was, conveniently, exactly the prescription that a woman who needed to escape her life for a while might have ordered herself. The doctor who diagnosed nervous exhaustion in an upper-class patient was often a family doctor of long standing, who understood perfectly well what he was doing. He was providing a social permission slip. The patient needed to not attend the forthcoming ball, or to withdraw from a house party that had become untenable, or to spend several weeks not being required to perform her marriage in public. A diagnosis of nerves provided the official justification. Nobody questioned it. Illness was a legitimate exemption from social obligation, in a world that otherwise offered almost none. The physical reality of Edwardian women's health was, separately, genuinely concerning. The corsets contributed to respiratory problems, displaced organs, and a kind of chronic physical discomfort that was considered entirely normal. Women who fainted in public, a phenomenon sufficiently common to be socially accommodated, with smelling salts regularly carried and fainting couches provided in withdrawing rooms, were often simply women whose clothing was preventing them from breathing adequately. This was not considered a design flaw. It was considered a feature of femininity. The susceptibility to fainting was even, in certain romantic registers, considered attractive. Pregnancy and its complications were another territory where the body registered its objections to the social arrangements surrounding it. Childbirth, in this era, even in wealthy households, carried genuine risks. Miscarriage was common and frequently not discussed, the medical and emotional experience absorbed privately, without the social acknowledgement that a death in the family would receive. A woman who had miscarried was expected to recover and resume her social functions on a timeline that had more to do with the season's calendar than her actual physical recovery. What's striking, reading the diaries and letters of Edwardian society women, is how many of them were unwell, more or less chronically, and how matter-of-factly they recorded it. The headaches, the nerves, the exhaustion, the various ailments that appeared and disappeared without clear diagnosis, these weren't performance, or not entirely. They were the body registering, in the only language the social world would accept, the cost of the performance it was required to maintain. The Edwardian lady was not fragile. She was, in fact, extraordinarily tough. But she was also living in a system that taxed her constantly and offered her almost no legitimate way to say so. For those with sufficient funds, geography provided one of the most reliable forms of discretion available. A trip to Baden-Baden, Biarritz, or one of the fashionable continental spas offered a woman the freedom of being somewhere other than home, in a social context where the rules were slightly looser and the witnessing eyes slightly fewer. The seaside towns and spa hotels of Europe were full of upper-class English women taking the waters, recovering from unspecified ailments, and coincidentally spending several weeks in proximity to men who were not their husbands. The spa was the Edwardian version of a location that technically everyone knew about and nobody discussed. It was considered respectable to go. Nobody asked too many questions about who else happened to be there. The geography of Edwardian discretion had a logic to it. London during the season was too densely observed, too many people who knew you, too many social connections that created witnesses, too much of the infrastructure of accountability. The country house was more private, but still contained the social machinery of the hostess and the household. The continent, however, offered something genuinely different. Distance, different social norms, the slight blurring of English social rules in a foreign context, and a level of anonymity that was practically impossible at home. Baden-Baden, the German spa town that was one of the most fashionable destinations of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, was a case in point. Its casino, its thermal baths, its gardens and promenades attracted a genuinely international crowd. European royalty, wealthy Americans, Russian aristocrats, the Edwardian English upper class, that created a social environment without the sharp social accountabilities of any single national community. You might encounter someone who knew you, of course. You might encounter many people who knew you, but encounters on the continent carried a different weight than encounters at home. The social contract around what was seen and what was reported operated slightly differently when everyone present was also, in some sense, away from their normal lives. Biarritz, the Atlantic resort town on the French Basque coast, served a similar function for a different social subset. Edward VII adored it and visited repeatedly, which brought the fashionable world in his wake and also established it as a place where a somewhat relaxed attitude toward the strict observance of social rules was built into the atmosphere. A woman at Biarritz was visibly there for her health, her enjoyment, and the sea air. The social permissions embedded in this framing were understood without articulation. The journey itself was significant. Travel in this era was slow enough and sufficiently separating from ordinary life that the weeks of a continental trip functioned as a genuine social parenthesis. You were between your normal contexts, between the London house and the country estate, between the social obligations of one season and another, in a space that belonged to neither. The hotels and pensions of the continent received you without the complex social history that attended you everywhere at home. The waiters did not know your family. The other guests were not connected to your social circle in the intricate, overlapping ways that English society connected everyone to everyone else. You could be, for a few weeks, slightly more simply yourself. The return was, of course, the difficulty. You came back, resumed the performance, and carried the parenthetical weeks back with you as private memory. The letters written from Biarritz or Baden-Baden, preserved in archives, have a different quality from the London letters, more relaxed, more directly emotional, occasionally more honest. They are the written residue of the geographical escape, the evidence that for a few weeks the performance was not the only thing happening. While the majority of upper-class Edwardian women navigated their lives within the existing social structures, a growing minority were doing something far more alarming, refusing to. The so-called new woman of the late Victorian and Edwardian era was educated, opinionated, possibly employed, probably cycling, and openly skeptical of the institution of marriage as it currently existed. She read political pamphlets. She attended lectures. She had, horrifyingly, opinions about the franchise. For the women operating within conventional society, the new woman was simultaneously admirable, threatening, and deeply inconvenient, because her existence raised, quietly and persistently, the question of whether the entire elaborate performance of Edwardian femininity was actually necessary at all. The figure of the new woman had been culturally prominent since the 1890s, when a wave of writing, novels, journalism, pamphlets began to articulate a vision of female existence that departed sharply from the conventional model. The new woman was educated, often at one of the newly established women's colleges at Oxford or Cambridge, though she would receive no formal degree from either until decades later, because the universities were not yet prepared to go that far. She might be employed in one of the expanding range of occupations that were beginning, tentatively, to open to women: teaching, nursing, clerical work, even some forms of writing and journalism. She might live independently, which in itself was a radical act in a world that assumed female existence required male superintendents. She almost certainly cycled. The bicycle, introduced to mass culture in the 1890s, was to Edwardian feminism roughly what the internet was to late 20th century politics. A genuinely transformative technology that expanded the possible. A woman on a bicycle could travel independently, without a chaperone, to distances beyond walking range. She could not be easily followed or supervised. She was mobile in a way that the conventions of upper-class feminine existence had never previously accommodated. The social resistance to women's cycling was therefore not entirely about propriety, though the debates about whether cycling was suitable were elaborate and entertaining, but about something more fundamental. The fact that a woman on a bicycle was, for the first time, genuinely free to go somewhere without asking anyone's permission. The reaction from conventional society was a mixture of mockery, anxiety, and the particular kind of social disapproval that attaches to things that are threatening rather than merely different. New women were caricatured in the press: mannish, humorless, strident, unattractive. The caricature was doing the work that arguments couldn't. If the new woman could be made to seem undesirable, her choices could be framed as failures rather than freedoms. Why would any sensible woman want to be like that, when she could instead be charming and well-dressed and attended to at dinner by men who found her delightful? And yet, within the drawing rooms of conventional society, the new woman exerted a different kind of pressure, not through ridicule but through example. She demonstrated that the performance was a choice, even if not every woman had the economic independence or social courage to refuse it. The fact that some women were openly declining the whole arrangement made the arrangement feel slightly less inevitable to the women still inside it, which was, of course, precisely what made her so disturbing. Upper-class Edwardian motherhood was, by modern standards, an exercise in strategic delegation. Children in aristocratic households were raised primarily by nannies and nursery staff, living in the nursery wing of the house in a parallel domestic world that intersected with their parents' lives during structured afternoon visits and formal meals. A mother might spend an hour or two with her children each day, well-dressed and warmly formal, before returning to the adult world of calls, correspondence, and social obligations. This was not considered cold, it was considered appropriate. The emotional distance between Edwardian upper-class parents and children was profound, and the consequences rippled forward in the letters these women wrote, in the memoirs their children later produced, and in the wistful quality that runs through so much Edwardian domestic writing. The nursery was, in the architecture of the large Edwardian house, a world unto itself. Located typically on the upper floors, away from the formal entertaining rooms and the adult bedrooms, it was staffed by a nanny, who was frequently a formidable woman with absolute authority over her domain, and one or more nursery maids who did the practical work under her direction. The children ate different food from the adults, kept different hours, were governed by different rules, and inhabited, day to day, a completely separate domestic reality that happened to share walls with the adult household. The nanny was, in practice, the primary adult figure in most upper-class Edwardian children's lives. She was there at breakfast and at bedtime. She was present during illness and during the ordinary days that make up the texture of childhood. She disciplined, comforted, taught table manners and basic prayers and the elementary social codes that govern nursery life. Some nannies were genuinely wonderful, warm, competent, imaginative, the source of real emotional security for children whose parents were constitutionally or socially unavailable. Others were strict to the point of severity, operating on the principle that children required firm management rather than emotional warmth. The variation was enormous, and the consequences for the children significant. The mother's relationship with her own children, in this context, was structured and limited in ways that modern parents would find almost incomprehensible. She visited the nursery in the late afternoon, dressed for the occasion, and the children were presented to her, scrubbed, combed, on their best behaviour, for a period of supervised interaction that was affectionate in its way but carried the quality of a performance within a performance. Everyone knew their role. The children knew to be charming. The mother knew to be warm and interested. The nanny stood in the background, monitoring, and then the visit ended, and everyone returned to their respective worlds. The emotional cost of this arrangement is visible in what these women wrote. The letters of Edwardian mothers to their children and children to their mothers have a particular poignancy, a reaching quality, as though the writers are trying to establish through words an intimacy that the physical structure of their lives didn't quite permit. The memoirs of their children, produced in later decades, often return to the nursery and its nanny with a warmth that is conspicuously more immediate than the warmth reserved for the mother, who was loved, but from a distance that was built into the very architecture of the house they grew up in. The apparent effortlessness of Edwardian upper-class life was underwritten by money that was, in many cases, increasingly precarious. The agricultural depression of the late 19th century had damaged the incomes of aristocratic families dependent on land rents. Many of the great houses were maintained through a combination of judicious American heiress marriages, welcome, dollar princess, careful economies invisible to guests, and a general social agreement not to discuss finances in polite company. For women, the relationship with money was even more constrained. They had very little legal control over it, however much of it nominally surrounded them. A wife's assets belonged to her husband. Her independence was therefore not just socially but legally circumscribed, which gave her practical reasons beyond social convention to stay inside the performance rather than step outside it. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 had made it legally possible for a married woman to own property in her own name, a reform that sounds basic and was, by any measure, long overdue, and which had been resisted for years by men who understood exactly what financial independence would mean for the social arrangements they were benefiting from. But even after the Act, the practical reality of upper-class women's financial lives was constrained. The family money, the estate, the investments, the income from land was managed by and in the name of the husband. A wife's personal allowance was exactly that, an allowance provided at her husband's discretion within limits he set. This meant that a woman who wanted to leave a bad marriage faced not just social ruin but financial catastrophe. She would leave with whatever personal property she had brought into the marriage and whatever allowance she could negotiate, both of which were likely to be insufficient to maintain anything resembling her former standard of living. The social position she had occupied derived from the marriage, not from herself, and it would not survive the marriage's end. She would be, in the most practical possible sense, on her own in a world that was not designed for women on their own and that would signal its opinion of her situation at every turn. The aristocracy's response to the agricultural depression and the general squeeze on traditional land-based incomes was, in many cases, the American heiress. From the 1880s onward, a steady stream of transatlantic marriages connected titled English families with the new American industrial fortunes, the Vanderbilts, the Jeromes, the various other families whose wealth was recent, enormous, and insufficiently aristocratic by American social standards, but absolutely transformative by English ones. The arrangement was mutually advantageous in theory. The American family got a title, the English family got money. The women at the centre of these arrangements, intelligent, often well-educated, frequently quite unprepared for what they were actually marrying into, got a complex social education very quickly. Consuelo Vanderbilt, married to the Duke of Marlborough in 1895, in a transaction her mother engineered with the thoroughness of a corporate merger, spent years in a marriage she later described with considerable frankness in her memoirs, The Money Saved Blenheim Palace. The marriage was not, by her account, a success in any personal sense. But it was socially correct, and for the purposes of the world she had been installed in, socially correct was the primary requirement. The silk and the great houses and the elaborate social performance rested, in the end, on a financial foundation that was more fragile than it appeared, and the women at its centre knew it and had no formal power to do anything about it. The years of the Edwardian era were also the years of the suffragette movement, and upper-class society women occupied a complicated, often uncomfortable position within that context. Some supported votes for women quietly, in private, while publicly remaining within the conventional social sphere. Some were active supporters or even members of suffrage organisations, which required navigating the significant social disapproval of their peers. Many were opposed, having absorbed the cultural argument that female influence operated most effectively through the domestic and social sphere, which was, conveniently, exactly the sphere in which they had spent their lives perfecting their performance. The question of the vote cut directly across the elaborate social architecture of Edwardian womanhood in ways that were rarely comfortable and rarely directly addressed. The suffragette movement of the Edwardian era was, by 1910, impossible to ignore. The Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, had moved from peaceful demonstration to direct action, window smashing, arson of postboxes, hunger strikes in prison, with a militancy that divided public opinion sharply and created particular awkwardness for upper-class women who might privately sympathise with the goal while being horrified by the methods. Throwing yourself in front of the King's horse at Epsom, as Emily Wilding Davison did in 1913, was not conduct that the Edwardian drawing room knew how to accommodate. It was too loud. It was too direct. It broke the fundamental rule of the entire performance, that a woman's power was exercised invisibly, through influence, through management, through the careful operation of social machinery that nobody was supposed to notice. Many society women supported suffrage in ways that were consistent with their existing social identities, through drawing room meetings, through the constitutional suffrage organisations that proceeded by petition and argument rather than action, through the careful social influence they could bring to bear on husbands and fathers, and the men in their networks who had the political power they were asking to share. This was, in a way, the suffrage argument conducted in fan language, indirect, coded, operating through the existing social architecture rather than against it. It was also, its critics argued, considerably less effective. The opposition within upper-class society was genuine and not always simply self-interested. Some women had absorbed the argument that the sphere of domestic and social influence was not a consolation prize, but a legitimate form of power, that women who managed households, raised children, shaped the social environment that formed men's values and political temperaments, were already exercising something more fundamental than the vote. This argument was not entirely without merit, and it was not exclusively made by women who feared change. It was made by women who had built real competence and real influence within the existing system, and who were not entirely wrong that the vote was not the only form of power that mattered. But the suffragette question also surfaced something that the entire Edwardian performance was designed to suppress: the gap between what women were told about their influence and what the actual legal and political reality was. You could influence your husband's vote, you could not cast one. You could manage the social world with extraordinary skill. You could not stand for Parliament. You could conduct an elaborate performance of domestic contentment. You could not, without catastrophic social consequences, refuse to. The suffragette movement named this gap loudly, publicly, and increasingly violently, and no amount of fan language or house party management or strategic deployment of the calling card system could quite drown it out. For an upper-class Edwardian woman, charitable and religious work provided one of the only socially sanctioned forms of activity outside the home and social calendar. Hospital visiting, Sunday school management, fundraising committees, flower arranging for the parish church. These were activities that required leaving the house, making decisions, managing people, and exercising genuine organizational intelligence, all wrapped in the thoroughly respectable frame of Christian duty. Many women found in charity work a degree of competence and purpose they simply could not access elsewhere. And a few, quietly, carefully, used the networks and skills built through charity work to support causes considerably more politically charged than the flower rota would suggest. The Church of England in the Edwardian era was not simply a religious institution, it was a social one. Sunday attendance was a social obligation as much as a spiritual one, and the church provided a weekly venue where the social hierarchy was physically arranged. Who sat in which pew communicated social position with the same precision as who sat where at dinner. The vicar was a figure of significance not merely because of his pastoral role, but because of his position within the social network of the parish, which in a rural area might be the only network that mattered. A woman who was prominent in the parish church was a woman who was prominent, full stop. The charitable activities that branched from the church were, in their way, a parallel social world that women managed almost entirely independently. The fundraising committees, the hospital visiting rotas, the organizations that distributed food and coal to the village poor in winter, these were administered by women, planned by women, and carried out by women, with the male clergy providing a nominal authority that was largely ceremonial. A woman who chaired the district nursing committee was exercising real executive function, making decisions, managing budgets, supervising personnel, solving problems. None of this was described in those terms. It was described as good works, but the skills were identical. Hospital visiting deserves its own consideration as a window into what Edwardian charity work actually involved. A woman who visited the sick poor in the local cottage hospital was moving through a social world entirely unlike her own, encountering poverty, illness, and the consequences of a life without the cushioning that her own social position provided. Some women found this genuinely distressing and retreated to more comfortable forms of charity. Others found it illuminating in ways that quietly reshaped their politics. The women who later became active in social reform, in housing reform, in public health campaigns, in the movement for better working conditions, often traced the origins of their political conviction to exactly this kind of direct encounter with the reality that their social world was otherwise carefully arranged to prevent them from seeing. The flower rota itself, the quintessential symbol of genteel Edwardian ladies' charity work, so mild and decorative that it has become almost a shorthand for inconsequential female activity, was rather more useful than it sounds. The woman in charge of the flower rota for the parish church knew every family in the parish, had access to the vicar's confidence, and was present in the church at times when conversations happened that the formal social world would never have accommodated. The flower rota was, in a small way, an intelligence and social network. Every woman who ran one knew this, whether she would have described it in those terms or not. What all of this adds up to is a picture of women exercising, through the officially approved channels of religious and charitable duty, a range of practical, social, and political competencies that their official social role declined to acknowledge. They were managing institutions, building networks, exercising judgment and leadership, and filing all of it under the heading of Christian womanhood, which was the one heading guaranteed not to raise objections. It was, in its way, one of the most elegant workarounds in the entire elaborate system. Floriography, the language of flowers, was not an Edwardian invention. It had been popular since the Victorian era, but it reached its practical peak in this period, when women had both the social constraint requiring indirect communication and the social resources to use it. The meanings were specific and, among those who knew them, entirely legible. Red roses meant love, of course, but the number mattered. Yellow roses meant friendship shading toward jealousy. White camellias meant perfect loveliness. Striped carnations meant no. A bouquet received from the right person at the right time could be a complete emotional declaration, delivered in a language that the uninitiated would read simply as a nice arrangement of flowers. The florists of Mayfair were, in this sense, unwitting participants in dozens of romantic dramas they knew nothing about. The formal codification of flower meanings had been circulating in popular culture since at least the 1820s, when a series of illustrated dictionaries of flower language were published and became fashionable gifts. By the Edwardian era, the system was sufficiently established that most educated women had at least a working vocabulary, and those who were particularly invested in the art of indirect communication had something closer to fluency. There were variations between different published sources. One dictionary might assign slightly different meanings from another, which added a layer of interpretive uncertainty that was itself part of the pleasure. Receiving a bouquet and working out exactly what it meant, within the particular conventions shared between sender and recipient, was a form of intellectual engagement that the official social world would not have recognized as such. The construction of a meaningful bouquet was therefore a skilled act. You didn't simply order flowers. You selected each element for its meaning and then composed them in a combination that, read correctly, said what you needed to say. A single red rose was a declaration. A red rose with its thorns left on communicated the same feeling with a warning attached. A white rose said, "I am worthy of you." A yellow one, placed alongside, complicated the message in a direction that depended on the context. The way the flowers were handed over mattered too. Upright meant a positive meaning. Inverted reversed it. A flower placed over the heart said one thing, placed over the head another. The receiving end required the same literacy. A woman who received an arrangement from someone she was romantically connected to would examine it with the attention of someone reading a letter, which is exactly what she was doing. The stems, the varieties, the combinations, the presence or absence of particular elements, a sprig of myrtle tucked among the roses, a small cluster of forget-me-nots placed where they couldn't be accidental. These were sentences, written in botanical code, delivered to her drawing room in a way that her husband might observe and would read simply as flowers, because flowers were something women received and arranged and admired, and the idea that they were also receiving encrypted correspondence in plain sight would not have suggested itself. The genius of the system was its invisibility to the uninitiated. A man who knew nothing of floriography could watch his wife receive a bouquet, watch her arrange it with apparent pleasure, and have no idea that she had just been told something that changed the texture of her entire afternoon. The flowers sat on the mantelpiece, visible to everyone in the room, broadcasting their message continuously to the one person who could read it and remaining silent to everyone else. It was the most elegant possible use of the Edwardian drawing room's own decorative conventions as cover. The flowers belonged there. Nobody questioned their presence. The message inside them was entirely safe. The afternoon call was the daily intelligence-gathering operation of Edwardian society, conducted in sitting rooms between the hours of 3 and 6, over small cups of tea and an assortment of biscuits. A woman of the upper classes might receive and return several calls a week, each one a carefully managed exchange of information, observation, and social positioning. Who had been seen where? Whose husband had been notably absent from a recent party? Which house party had produced an interesting seating arrangement? The information exchanged was rarely explicit. This was not gossip in the tabloid sense, but something more oblique and more devastating, conducted in the gentle, relentless vocabulary of implication, raised eyebrows, and very slightly too long pauses. The afternoon call was governed by rules so specific they had their own published etiquette literature. You arrived between 3 and 6, never earlier, never later. You stayed between 15 and 25 minutes, long enough to complete the social transaction, short enough to signal that you respected the hostess's time and had other calls to make, which was itself a social communication. Too short a visit implied indifference. Too long implied either social cluelessness or a particular agenda. The precisely calibrated visit, arriving and departing at exactly the right intervals with exactly the right warmth and exactly the right content, was a performance as technically demanding as anything else in this world. The sitting room in which calls were received was itself a communication. The arrangement of objects on the mantelpiece, the selection of flowers, the presence or absence of particular books or items of needlework All told a story to the observant caller about the household's current social state. A house in which the flowers were slightly stale communicated something. A house in which there were more callers present than usual communicated something else. The hostess's dress, whether she was in a formal afternoon gown or something slightly more casual, whether her hair was particularly well arranged, told the caller whether she had been expecting company and had taken pains accordingly. The conversation that occurred within these visits was a masterpiece of information density dressed as pleasantry. Nothing impolite was said, nothing overtly accusatory, but an enormous amount was communicated through the architecture of what was and wasn't mentioned. A woman who asked after your husband with a particular warmth was telling you that she had recently encountered him somewhere, and she wanted you to know that she knew. A woman who failed to mention a recent party to which you had both been invited, speaking as though it hadn't happened, was enacting a small social erasure. A woman who praised another woman's appearance with a slight excess of enthusiasm was communicating something about that woman's appearance that the praise was designed to obscure. The raised eyebrow was perhaps the most expressive single gesture in the Edwardian social vocabulary. Deployed correctly, it could communicate anything from mild amusement to devastating skepticism without requiring a word to be spoken that could be repeated. A woman who had just been told something she found implausible could raise an eyebrow and produce, in her interlocutor, an immediate understanding that the information was being assessed and found wanting. Without ever having said so directly, the eyebrow was deniable, the eyebrow was elegant, the eyebrow, in the right hands, was a weapon. What all of this amounted to was a social monitoring system of extraordinary sophistication, operating continuously through the medium of apparently pleasant social interaction. Every call was a data point. The accumulated calls of a season produced a social map of who was connected to whom, who was in favour and who was not, whose reputation was solid and whose was showing the first small hairline cracks that, if they widened, would eventually bring the whole structure down. The women who managed this system most skillfully, who extracted the most information while surrendering the least, who shaped the social narrative most effectively while appearing simply to be having tea, were not gossiping, they were governing. The Edwardian era ended with the First World War, and the war did to the social structures of the upper classes what centuries of gradual change had failed to do. It dismantled them, quickly, completely, and permanently. The great houses emptied as men went to war. Women who had spent their lives managing house parties found themselves managing hospitals. The domestic staff that had maintained the elaborate machinery of upper-class social life dispersed into war work and never entirely returned. When the survivors came home, the world that had required the performance was gone. The rules that had shaped every gesture, every letter, every fan angle and parasol tilt dissolved with a speed that must have been both liberating and bewildering. Some women mourned it. Some had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for exactly this. The declaration of war in August 1914 arrived in the middle of the season, and the season simply stopped. House parties were cancelled. Balls were postponed, then abandoned. The elaborate social machinery of Edwardian upper-class life, which had been running with the smooth inevitability of an extremely expensive clock, stopped ticking, and the silence it left was, for the women who had organized their entire existence around it, genuinely disorienting. What do you do with the calls and the carefully positioned cards and the strategic seating plans when all the men who made them necessary have left for France? The answer, for most of these women, was to turn the same organizational intelligence they had deployed in the management of social life toward the management of the war effort. Country houses became convalescent hospitals, and the women who had hosted weekend parties became, almost overnight, the administrators of nursing facilities. The skills were not entirely different. You were still managing large numbers of people in a residential setting, still coordinating complex logistics, still maintaining the emotional temperature of an institution under pressure. The difference was that the stakes were real in a way that the social stakes had never quite been, and the work was acknowledged as work, which the social management never had been. The women who served in voluntary aid detachments, who ran hospital supply organizations, who managed food distribution networks and refugee relief committees, discovered something about themselves that the Edwardian social world had provided very little opportunity to discover, that they were competent, in a direct and practical sense, in ways that went considerably beyond flower arranging and calling card management. The confidence this produced was not universal, and it did not arrive without cost. The war was, above all, a catastrophe, and the women who lived through it lost fathers, brothers, husbands, sons. But it was real, and it did not entirely disappear when the war ended. What came back in 1918 was a different world. The great houses that remained required smaller staffs, because the large domestic service workforce of the Edwardian era had found other employment and largely didn't return. The social season resumed in a diminished form, and the balls and calls and country house parties continued, but with a different quality, faster, louder, slightly desperate, running on the same social forms, but without quite the same conviction that the forms were eternal. The 1920s were Edwardian high society with something essential removed, the absolute certainty that this was how things were and how they would always be. The corsets were gone, more or less. The chaperones were fading. The elaborate fan language and flower meanings and parasol angles were receding into the slightly embarrassed past. The performance had not ended. Women were still expected to be charming and appropriate and managed in their social presentation. But the specific, total, every gesture is significant performance of the Edwardian drawing room was over. The world it had been designed for had been obliterated. And some of the women who had lived inside it, looking back, felt something that they would not quite have called grief, and would not quite have called relief, something in between, for a world that had constrained them completely and sustained them absolutely and was now, irrevocably, gone. One of the most extraordinary things about Edwardian society women is how much they wrote. Letters, diaries, private journals, these women, trained to silence and discretion in public, poured an astonishing volume of feeling onto private paper. Their archives are full of wit, intelligence, frustration, longing, and the particular quality of sadness that comes from a life spent performing a version of yourself rather than being one. The letters between women friends in this era are especially striking, intimate, funny, philosophically sharp, and suffused with a kind of relief at being in correspondence where the rules didn't apply. Reading them, you encounter women who are clearly extraordinary, and who clearly knew it, and who had been living, for most of their conscious lives, inside a set of constraints that was never, quite, large enough to contain them. The diary was, for many Edwardian women, the one space where the performance was not required. Within the pages of a private journal, a woman could say what she actually thought about the dinner party, the house party, the marriage. The correspondence that arrived from someone she was not supposed to be receiving correspondence from. The diaries of Edwardian society women, where they survive, are genuinely startling documents, not because the content is scandalous, though sometimes it is, but because of the contrast between the voice on the page and the voice implied by the public record of the same woman's life. The women who appear in newspaper society columns as gracious, composed, impeccably correct, the women whose names appear on guest lists and charitable committee rosters and church flower rotas, turn out, in their diaries, to have had opinions, sharp ones, frequently, about their husbands, about their social obligations, about the world they were living in, about the gap between what they were permitted to say and what they actually thought. The wit that surfaces in these private pages is often remarkable, dry, precise, occasionally vicious, in the tradition of women who have been trained to be charming in company and have therefore had nowhere to put their actual observations except onto paper in private. The letters between women friends are perhaps even more revealing than the diaries, because they are relational rather than solo. They show the correspondence being caught and returned, the two voices developing a shared language and shared observations over years of written exchange. Women who had known each other since childhood, or since their debutante seasons, and who had maintained their friendship through decades of separate marriages and households, wrote to each other with a freedom and directness that their public social personae didn't permit. These letters discuss real things, real feelings about marriages, real anxieties about children, real political opinions, real responses to the events of their era. The practical reason so much survived is partly that letter writing was the primary medium of Edwardian communication and therefore produced an enormous volume of material, and partly that domestic archiving, the preservation of correspondence in boxes and trunks, was something these households did naturally. The irony is that the same discretion that governed their public lives extended to how the archives were managed. Certain letters were destroyed, certain periods are conspicuously thin, and you can sometimes see, in the gaps, the outline of what was removed. A cache of letters that stops abruptly in a particular year, a diary that resumes after a gap of several months with no explanation. The archive itself tells you things in the language of what's missing. What remains, taken together, is one of the richest records of interior female life in any period of English history. A record produced almost accidentally by women who were writing for themselves or for trusted friends rather than for posterity, and who left behind, in the privacy of their prose, a full-dimensioned account of what it actually felt like to be alive, intelligent, and female in Edwardian England. If there is one Edwardian society woman who can be said to have conducted an entire brilliant, indiscreet, unrepeatable life in open defiance of the rules she was technically living by, it is Margot Tennant, later Margot Asquith, wife of the Prime Minister. Margot was extraordinary. She hunted, she wrote. She said absolutely whatever she was thinking, with a directness that her contemporaries found both exhilarating and occasionally ruinous. Her memoirs, published in 1920, were considered shocking by almost everyone who read them, full of frank assessments of public figures, honest accounts of social dynamics, and the kind of intelligence about how the Edwardian world actually worked that polite society had spent decades successfully suppressing. Margot was not performing respectability. She was, with enormous energy and considerable humour, dismantling the performance from the inside. Margot Tennant was born in 1864, the sixth of 12 children of a Scottish industrialist who had made a substantial fortune and was, by the time Margot came of age, thoroughly integrated into the highest social circles. She made her social debut in the early 1880s and was immediately distinctive, not in the conventional sense of beauty, which her contemporaries assessed as considerable but unconventional, but in the sense of presence. She was electric. She said things at dinner that made people choke on their soup, and then said something else that made them laugh before they had recovered. She was, in the most genuinely disruptive way, entertaining. Her circle, the Souls, a group of aristocratic and intellectual young people who met in the 1880s and 90s to talk about ideas, literature, and life, with a freedom unusual in society, suited her perfectly. The Souls prized genuine intellectual engagement over the social performance that dominated the mainstream aristocratic world, and among them Margot found an audience that appreciated her as she actually was rather than requiring her to be a drawing-room ornament. She hunted seriously, fearlessly, at a level of skill that commanded respect from men who might otherwise have been condescending. She wrote. She argued. She had, by any measure, opinions. Her marriage to Herbert Henry Asquith in 1894 brought her into proximity with real political power. Asquith rose to become Prime Minister in 1908, and Margot found herself in Downing Street, a position that might have been expected to moderate her. It did not. She continued to say precisely what she thought about public figures, political events, and the general conduct of British affairs with a freedom that caused her husband considerable political embarrassment on multiple occasions. She was brilliant company and a political liability, often within the same conversation. The memoirs she published after the war were the fullest expression of her refusal to be contained. They were frank about people who were still alive. They were frank about herself, about her limitations as well as her qualities, about the things she had got wrong and the things she was proud of. They were, above all, the memoir of someone who had decided that the performance of discretion and appropriate femininity was not worth the cost of the alternative, which was saying what you actually knew and thought about the world you had been living in. Polite society was appalled. The book sold extraordinarily well. Not every Edwardian society woman who harboured inconvenient political opinions was willing to sacrifice her social position to act on them publicly. But the gap between private conviction and public performance was, for some women, a space of genuine and creative action. Donations made anonymously to suffrage organisations. Servants quietly helped to find new positions when they needed to escape difficult circumstances. Guest lists quietly shaped to include writers, thinkers and reformers who might otherwise have found the drawing room door closed to them. The salons of progressive-leaning Edwardian hostesses functioned as quiet incubators for ideas that would eventually, after considerable difficulty, reshape the world. They weren't marching, but they weren't simply doing nothing either. The anonymous donation was perhaps the most common form of secret radicalism available to an Edwardian society woman. Money given without a name attached couldn't be traced back to create social difficulties. The Women's Social and Political Union, the constitutional suffrage societies, the organisations working on housing reform and public health, all received funding from sources that were never publicly identified, and some portion of that funding came from women whose husbands would have been appalled to know about it, whose social circles would have registered the association with considerable coolness, and who were therefore operating in the one way available to them, financially, anonymously, effectively. The drawing room salon, an institution with a long history in European intellectual life, was the other primary vehicle. A hostess who chose her guest lists with care could create, in her own sitting room, a gathering that mixed politicians with reformers, writers with social campaigners, artists with aristocrats, in combinations that produced conversations and connections that would not otherwise have occurred. The salon's power lay in the social neutralization that the hostess's own respectability provided. If Lady So-and-so invited a known suffragette to her dinner, the suffragette's attendance became respectable by association, at least for the duration of the evening, and the conversations that resulted happened in a context of social legitimacy that the suffragette could not have provided herself. Some women went further than anonymous donations and strategic guest lists. The Countess of Carlisle, known in her family as the Radical Countess, was a temperance campaigner and Liberal Party supporter who drained the wine cellars of Castle Howard in a fit of conviction that her family apparently found both principled and extremely inconvenient. Lady Bathurst owned and ran the Conservative Morning Post newspaper. Beatrice Webb, though not a conventional society woman, moved in circles that overlapped with the aristocracy and used those connections relentlessly in the service of Fabian socialist research and reform. What these women shared, across the range of their political positions, was an understanding that the social capital they had accumulated through their conventional lives, the connections, the access, the credibility conferred by their social positions, was usable. It could be deployed in the service of causes that the conventional social world disapproved of, not through direct confrontation, but through the kind of quiet, persistent, structurally invisible action that was, after all, exactly the mode of operation that the entire Edwardian social training had prepared them for. They had spent their lives learning to influence without appearing to. It turned out that skill was transferable. Edward VII died in 1910, and with him died something that was already in truth dying: the particular confidence of Edwardian high society that the world was correctly arranged and would continue to be. His son George V was a different kind of king, domestic, morally conservative, personally disapproving of the easy sexual politics of his father's court. The Marlborough House set's successors found the social temperature cooler. The great house parties continued, but something had shifted. 1917-4, 215-7. The absolute certainty that everyone knew the rules and would maintain them, that quiet, total confidence that underpinned the entire performance, was gone. And then the war came, and the performance became not just difficult but absurd. The world these women had been trained for had ended. What came next was something none of them had been prepared for: the freedom to be someone else. George V's accession changed the social atmosphere of the court with immediate effect. Where Edward had been louche, continental in his tastes, and personally relaxed about behaviour that his mother had found appalling, George was none of these things. He was a naval officer, domestically devoted, and possessed of a strong personal conservatism that extended to his view of how the court and its associated social world should conduct itself. The Marlborough House set's approach to marriage, the acknowledged mistresses, the country house room assignments, the general social permission to behave like educated adults about human nature was not something the new king modelled or encouraged. The social temperature dropped several degrees, and those at the top of the social hierarchy adjusted accordingly. The aristocratic house party continued into the 1910s, but the mood had shifted. There was, in the accounts that survive from this period, a quality of slight uncertainty, the sense that the confident social architecture of the Edwardian peak years was showing its age. Economic pressures on great estates were increasing. The social season required ever more money to maintain at the expected level. The servant question, the difficulty of staffing a large household at pre-war levels and expectations, was already becoming apparent before the war actually began. The machinery was still running, but it was running more audibly, and the people who depended on it were aware of the noise. The suffragette movement was making the social world increasingly uncomfortable in ways that couldn't be entirely managed through the normal social mechanisms. You could exclude a suffragette from your guest list. You could decline to discuss the subject at dinner. You couldn't prevent the newspaper coverage, the window breaking in the West End, the hunger strikes that made the government look simultaneously authoritarian and helpless. The political world was intruding into the social world with a persistence that social management could slow but not stop, and the women who had built their lives inside the social world felt the intrusion in ways that were unsettling precisely because they couldn't be addressed through the normal social tools. And then the assassination at Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, and the sequence of events that followed so rapidly that the season was still technically ongoing when war was declared. The hunting parties already being planned for autumn were cancelled. The invitations already sent for September house parties were quietly withdrawn. The elaborate social calendar, which had been ticking forward with the inevitability of an institution that believed in its own permanence, simply stopped. The women who had managed it stood in their emptied great houses and understood, in the particular way that people understand things, when the evidence is overwhelming and the implications are enormous, that the world they had been trained for was over. What came next? Nobody quite knew, but it was going to require a different performance entirely, or, for the first time, perhaps no performance at all. There is a tendency, in our own era, to romanticize Edwardian women as glamorous figures in beautiful dresses who floated through a world of elegance and managed everything magnificently. The costumes were genuinely extraordinary. The social skill was real. But the romanticization tends to smooth over what the performance actually cost: the physical pain of the clothes, the psychological labor of the constant management, the grief of the marriages that offered title and security but not warmth, the specific loneliness of being brilliant in a context that had no use for brilliance. The letters written at 3 a.m. to someone who understood. The Edwardian society woman was not a decorative figure from a pretty period. She was a person living an extremely constrained life with extraordinary intelligence and, in many cases, extraordinary courage. The romanticization operates primarily through aesthetics. The photographs and portraits of Edwardian society women are genuinely beautiful, the clothes are spectacular, the settings are magnificent, the formal poses convey a composure that photographs well across a century. Television and film adaptations of the period lean into this because visually it offers almost irresistible material. The houses, the gardens, the clothes, the elaborate social rituals with their inherent drama and their surface of perfect manners. Downton Abbey is set slightly later but captures the aesthetic perfectly and captures, to its credit, some of the constraints as well. But even the most sympathetic fictional treatments tend to make the constraints into plot devices rather than the total structural reality of a life. The physical cost of the clothes alone deserves to be taken seriously rather than aestheticized. The corsets of the early Edwardian period were genuinely harmful to the women wearing them, restricting breathing, displacing organs, creating chronic pain that was so normalized it didn't register as pain in the surviving accounts, just as a background condition of physical existence. The elaborate hairstyles required hours of daily maintenance. The social obligation to be dressed appropriately for every occasion, morning dress, afternoon dress, calling dress, dinner dress, evening dress, all different, all requiring their own foundations and accessories, meant that a significant portion of every day was spent simply being assembled and disassembled, with the assistance of a lady's maid, into the correct presentation for the next social requirement. The psychological cost is harder to quantify, but equally real. Consider the sustained labour of constant social performance, the monitoring of every expression, every word, every gesture for its social correctness, every day, without intermission, for decades. Consider what it costs to be intelligent in a context that doesn't want your intelligence, but wants your charm. Consider the loneliness of a life in which the people who know you best are either a paid employee or someone you can only see in the socially managed, externally observed contexts of dinner parties and house parties, and the intimacy you actually need can only be conducted in letters written at night and delivered by a trusted intermediary. What the romanticization misses, above all, is the resilience that the reality required. These were not women floating effortlessly through beautiful rooms. They were women who had developed, through necessity, levels of emotional and social intelligence that were genuinely extraordinary, who had learned to operate at full capacity within a system designed to limit them, who found the gaps in the rules and lived in them, who maintained their interior lives in the face of a world that was comprehensively indifferent to those interior lives. That is not romantic, exactly. It is something better. It is remarkable. The Edwardian era ended. The women who had been trained to live in it had to reinvent themselves, and many of them did, with a resourcefulness that should not, in retrospect, surprise anyone who has paid attention to what it actually took to navigate the world they came from. Former society hostesses became hospital administrators. Women who had spent decades managing the social and domestic machinery of great houses turned that organizational intelligence toward public work, charity, politics. Some wrote, some traveled. Some, quietly and with enormous relief, simply stopped performing. The codes and signals and parasol angles and carefully positioned calling cards were set aside. What remained, underneath all of it, was exactly what it had always been. Women of considerable intelligence and stubborn, unextinguishable life, who had been waiting, rather a long time, to be somewhere that was large enough to hold them. The reinvention took many forms, and it did not happen at once. The 1920s did not arrive in January 1919 and immediately free everyone. The transition from the Edwardian world to whatever came after it was gradual, uneven, and experienced very differently depending on individual circumstances. Women with independent money had more options than women without. Women who had developed professional competencies through war work had more options than women who had spent the war years in charitable rather than operational roles. Women who had maintained their own intellectual lives, who had read and written and thought, even in the margins of the social performance, had internal resources to draw on that others did not. Some made the transition into public life directly. Women who had run convalescent hospitals during the war stood, or helped others stand, for election to the new local authorities and eventually to Parliament after the partial enfranchisement of 1918 and the full enfranchisement of 1928. The skills of the great Edwardian hostess, the ability to read a room, manage competing interests, build consensus without appearing to coerce, and maintain a public face of unruffled competence while managing chaos underneath, turned out to be remarkably transferable to political life. Nobody said so. The political world preferred to believe that women were new to power. Several of the women entering it knew better. Some wrote, The memoir boom of the 1920s and 30s produced a significant body of work by women who had lived at or near the centre of Edwardian society and had decided, in the changed circumstances of the post-war world, that some of what they knew was worth recording. Margot Asquith's memoirs were the most famous and most controversial, but she was not alone. These books were, collectively, a form of social archiving, an attempt to record, before the living memory faded entirely, what it had actually been like to inhabit that world from the inside. They were also, in many cases, a form of reckoning, an honest assessment of the costs and compensations of the lives their authors had lived, conducted with a frankness that the world they were describing would never have permitted. Some simply stopped. Women who had spent 40 years performing the role of Edwardian society wife, with its endless social obligations and its requirement of perpetual pleasant composure, found that the war had loosened the social compulsion sufficiently that a degree of retirement from the performance was possible. They gave fewer dinner parties. They returned fewer calls. They spent more time in the country and less in London. They read more. They wrote letters that said what they actually meant. They discovered, cautiously, that the world did not end if you failed to appear at a social function that you had no interest in attending. The women who survived the Edwardian era's end and made their way into the different, harder, freer world that followed, carried with them something that the era had, perhaps inadvertently, produced. A very high tolerance for gap between public performance and private reality. A highly developed skill for operating in conditions that were not designed for you, and an absolutely unshakable knowledge of their own intelligence and capability that 60 years of being told to be charming rather than clever had not succeeded in extinguishing. They had been trained for a world that no longer existed. They turned out to be ready for the one that had replaced it, which was, in its way, the finest possible tribute to everything they had managed to keep alive underneath the performance. And so, as the last candle gutters down in the drawing room, as the final calling card is placed on the silver tray and the fan is folded away for the evening, we leave the Edwardian society woman exactly where we found her, composed, immaculate, and considerably more complicated than she appeared. She lived inside a world that asked everything of her, and acknowledged almost none of it. She maintained a performance so total and so sustained that it is genuinely difficult, looking at the photographs, to see the person behind the posture. And yet the person was there, in the letters written at midnight, in the diaries kept in locked drawers, in the fan held just so, in the bouquet examined with the attention of someone reading a message that only she could decode. She was always there. The world she inhabited simply required her to be there quietly. What she leaves behind is not just the beautiful clothes and the magnificent houses and the elaborate social rituals that we find so endlessly fascinating from the comfortable distance of our own era. She leaves behind something more useful, a record of what it looks like when extraordinary intelligence and capability are poured, of necessity, into the only channels available. The flower arrangements and the afternoon calls and the perfectly managed house parties, these were not small things, and they were not done by small people. They were done by women who, given different circumstances, might have run countries, and some of them, in their way, did. Tonight, as you settle into your clean and unstructured life, where you may say what you think at dinner, wear what you like in public, and send a message directly to anyone you choose without a coded fan angle or a lady's maid intermediary, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the women who navigated a world of beautiful, relentless constraint and navigated it, by every available measure, brilliantly. They were not victims of their era, exactly, though the era asked more of them than it had any right to. They were its most skilled inhabitants, the people who understood its rules most completely and therefore knew, better than anyone, exactly where the rules could be bent. They managed, they adapted, they found the gaps and lived in them, with wit and intelligence and a stubbornness that no number of corsets or calling cards or strategic house party room assignments ever quite extinguished. And now, in the quiet of wherever you are, let them rest. Let the drawing rooms empty and the candles go out and the last of the afternoon callers make their way home through the soft Edwardian dusk. You, however, can simply close your eyes. The performance for tonight is over. Sleep well,